The first time Mae Langley left something on Joseph Brooks's doorstep, she genuinely believed he might throw it into the creek. It was the autumn of 1874, and the high country of Colorado Territory had already begun its annual transformation, painting the aspen groves in shades of gold and amber that seemed almost too beautiful for a world as harsh as the one Mae had come to know. She had arrived in the small town of Crestfall 3 weeks prior, having taken a position as the town's schoolteacher after the previous one. A reedy man named Horace Pittman had up and married a widow in Denver and never returned. Mae was 24 years old, clear-eyed and possessed of a stubbornness her late mother had once called a blessing and her father had called a trial. She called it practical. Crestfall was not much to look at. It had a general store run by a stout, cheerful woman named Bernadette Coles, a saloon that doubled as the only doctor's office when Dr. Emmett Hale was sober enough to work, a livery stable, a church that leaned slightly to the east as though it were listening for something in the mountains, and perhaps 40 souls scattered between the town proper and the surrounding homesteads and cabins that dotted the foothills of the San Juan Range. The schoolhouse sat at the edge of town, a single-room building with 4 decent windows and a wood stove that had seen better decades. It was Bernadette who first told me about Joseph Brooks, though she said the name in the particular way people say names that carry weight, letting it settle heavy into the air before moving on. "There's a man lives up the ridge about 2 miles past the Harmon property," Bernadette said one afternoon while Mae was purchasing a length of cotton and some writing chalk. "Goes by Brooks. Joseph Brooks, trapper mostly, comes down to town maybe once a month, sometimes less, buys his supplies and leaves without so much as a nod to anybody." She paused, arranging tins on a shelf with deliberate concentration. "He is not an unkind man, I don't think, just a man who has decided the world has nothing particular to offer him anymore." "What happened to him?" Mae asked, because it seemed like there was a story behind those words, and Mae had always been drawn to stories the way other women were drawn to fine fabric. Bernadette was quiet for a moment. "His wife passed, coming on 6 years ago now. Fever took her and their little one too, a boy not yet 2. Before that, Joseph Brooks was as fine a neighbor as you could ask for. After that, he went up the mountain and stayed there. We don't ask much more of him than he's willing to give." Mae carried that story home with her the same way she carried her purchases, carefully, aware of its weight. She met him for the first time on a Tuesday in October, which she would later consider one of the most inauspicious first meetings in the history of human relations. She had been walking the Ridge Road in the early morning, taking the route that Bernadette had mentioned would cut 20 minutes off the journey to the Patterson homestead, where she was expected for supper that evening, and she needed to familiarize herself with the path before the light faded. She had her coat buttoned to the throat and her dark hair pinned sensibly beneath her hat, and she was carrying a small satchel with a book in it because Mae Langley did not go anywhere without a book. She heard him before she saw him. There was the sound of an axe splitting wood, rhythmic and certain, coming from somewhere off the trail. Then she rounded a bend and there was the cabin, sturdy and low-built, with a good stone chimney and a woodpile that would have impressed a lesser woman. And there was Joseph Brooks. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of genuine work rather than vanity, with dark hair gone a little long and a beard that had been trimmed with some care, which surprised her. She had expected someone entirely wild. He was perhaps 30, perhaps a few years more, and when he looked up from his splitting block and saw her standing there on the ridge path, his expression arranged itself into something that was not quite unwelcoming but was certainly not warm. "This is private land," he said. His voice was low and even. "I apologize," Mae said immediately. "I was told this path leads down to the Patterson property. I didn't mean to come across anyone's land." "It does lead there. Stay on the path and you'll be fine." He turned back to his woodpile. Mae stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, taking in the cabin, the nearly stacked logs, the well-tended kitchen garden that was by now mostly put to bed for winter but showed the evidence of considerable care, A man who tended a kitchen garden was not entirely lost to the world, she thought. "I'm Mae Langley," she said, "the new schoolteacher." He did not look up. "I know who you are." Mae waited, but no reciprocal introduction was forthcoming. She knew, of course, who he was. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks," she said, and walked on. She thought about him all the way to the Patterson place, which annoyed her. The second time she encountered him was at Bernadette's store, 2 weeks later, and she had just enough time to observe him before he became aware of her presence. He was standing at the counter with a list written on a scrap of paper, and he was reading it over with the focused attention of a man who has learned to be precise about what he needs and nothing more. He did not linger over anything. He did not look at the small display of books and periodicals near the window. He concluded his business, paid in coin, and turned to leave. He stopped when he saw her. "Miss Langley," he said, which at least meant he had retained her name. "Mr. Brooks." She stepped aside to let him pass, and he did, with a brief nod that she chose to count as something. It was the following week that the thing with the doorstep began, and it began entirely by accident. Mae had taken it upon herself to bake bread on Saturdays, both because she found the work meditative and because a single woman living in a boarding house generated a certain amount of goodwill by sharing what she produced. She had made 2 loaves that particular Saturday, and while wrapping them she found herself thinking about the man up on the ridge, alone in that well-kept cabin with his kitchen garden put to bed and no one to speak to. She thought about Bernadette's words. A man who has decided the world has nothing particular to offer him. She knew, in a reasonable part of her mind, that taking a loaf of bread to a man who had not asked for her company was liable to be received badly. But Mae had another part of her mind that was considerably less reasonable and considerably more insistent, and that part pointed out that bread was not company, bread was bread, and that no one in the history of suffering had been made worse by a good loaf left at their door. She went up the ridge path with the wrapped loaf tucked under her arm and a perfectly prepared speech about how she had baked more than she needed and thought he might make use of it. She arrived at the edge of his property and immediately lost her nerve for a direct approach when she saw that his horse was not at the hitching post and the cabin showed no smoke. He was out then. She walked up to the door, set the loaf on the broad flat stone that served as his front step, and left without a word. She told herself, walking back down, that she had done a practical and neighborly thing, and she half believed it. The next time she walked the ridge path 4 days later, there was a small bundle of dried sage sitting on the stone step of her boarding house room, left in such a way that it was clearly deliberate and clearly untraceable. No note, no explanation. Bernadette, when consulted, allowed that sage grew abundantly near the creek on the eastern side of the Brooks property, and that she personally could think of only one person in Crestfall who would leave anything without a signature. Mae pressed the sage between the pages of the book she was reading and felt unreasonably pleased about it. She told herself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. November came to the San Juan foothills with the authority of a landlord who knows he is owed. The cold descended from the high country and settled into the valley, and the first real snow came on a Thursday night when Mae was in the schoolhouse by lamplight preparing lessons for the following week. She walked home in half an inch of fresh white, listening to the silence that snow makes and feeling it press against the inside of her chest in the complicated way that great beauty sometimes does, both joyful and a little sad. The following Saturday she made a pot of apple butter from the last of the autumn apples that the Pattersons had generously shared with her, and she put some in a small crock and wrapped it in cloth and went up the ridge path before the second snowfall could make it impassable. This time she was not going to lose her nerve. She intended to knock, and if answered, to say her prepared speech and be done with it. He answered. He came to the door in his shirt and braces, no coat, carrying what appeared to be a length of harness leather he had been working. The interior of the cabin behind him was warm and firelit and neater than she had expected, with a good stack of books on a shelf near the hearth that she immediately wanted to examine but refrained from mentioning. "Miss Langley," he said, and there was something in his expression that was not surprise. He had heard her on the path, she realized. He had had time to decide whether to answer. He had answered. "I made apple butter," she said, with no preamble to speak of, holding out the crock. "I had more than I can use, and I thought it would be a shame to let it go to waste." He looked at the crock. He looked at her. The silence stretched for a moment that was not quite uncomfortable but was not quite comfortable either. "That's a fair amount of apple butter," he said. "I may have overestimated how much apple butter one person needs," Mae said, which was, strictly speaking, true. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. Not a smile precisely, but the architecture of one. He took the crock. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," she said, and turned and walked back down the ridge path before she could ruin it by saying anything else. She was almost to the bend in the path when she heard him call after her. "The bread was good," he said. She turned. He was still in the doorway, holding the crock, watching her from 20 yards away with an expression she could not quite read at that distance. "I'm glad," she said, and kept walking, and the unreasonable pleased feeling stayed with her all the way back to town and through the rest of the afternoon. It was Bernadette who informed her, the following week, that she had apparently done something unprecedented. "Mrs. Patterson tells me that Joseph Brooks came down to the store yesterday and bought himself a small crock of honey," Bernadette said, in the measured tones of a woman reporting a remarkable geological event. "And that when she asked him how he was getting on, he said he was getting on well." She looked at me with bright, knowing eyes. "He hasn't told anyone he was getting on well in 6 years." Me found something to study on the shelf near the window. December arrived, and with it a cold so complete and deep that the world seemed carved from it. Me made sure her students arrived at school with adequate coats, and occasionally sent home small packets of cornbread or biscuits with the children whose families she knew were having a hard season of it. She was not wealthy, not by any measure, but she had enough, and enough in her experience had always meant something to share. She went up the ridge path again 10 days before Christmas with a tin of ginger biscuits she had made at the Pattersons' kitchen, which had the advantage of a proper baking oven. She had thought, going up, that she would simply leave them on the step if he was out, but as she approached, she saw smoke from the chimney and paused. He came around the corner of the cabin before she reached the door, carrying a load of firewood, and he stopped when he saw her. He was bundled against the cold in a heavy coat and a wool hat pulled down over his ears, and the sight of him was so ordinary and so unexpectedly right that me had to take a moment to manage her expression. "I brought biscuits," she said. He looked at her for a long moment in the gray winter light. "You don't have to keep doing this," he said, and his voice was careful, not unkind. "I know that," me said equally. "I'm not looking for charity. Then it's lucky what I'm bringing is biscuits." Another of those almost smiles. He stood there with his arms full of wood, and she stood there with her tin of biscuits, and the cold wind moved between them. "You could come inside," he said, "if you wanted to get out of the cold." The cabin was exactly as she had imagined from the brief glimpse through the doorway. The books on the shelf were varied and well-read, their spines worn, and she went straight to them without quite meaning to and ran her finger along their titles. Emerson, Thoreau, a compendium of natural history, 2 volumes of Shakespeare, a copy of Moby Dick that had been read more than once, and several others. She turned to find him watching her with the expression of a man who has revealed something he did not intend to. "You've read all of these," she said. It was not a question. "Most of them more than once," he said, setting the firewood in the box near the hearth. "It's a long winter up here. I have the Shakespeare at home," she said, "the same edition. I bought it in Cincinnati, where I'm from originally." He paused in his work. "You're from Cincinnati, born and raised, came west with my father when I was 17 after my mother passed. He took a farming claim in Kansas, but the land was harder than advertised. He passed on 4 years ago." She said this simply, without self-pity, because she had had time to make peace with it. "I've been teaching since then." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry about your father." "And I'm sorry about your wife," she said gently. "And your son." The air in the cabin changed. He straightened and looked at her with an expression that was complicated in ways she could only begin to map. "Bernadette," he said, "she speaks of you with great affection and no malice," Mae said, "and only because I asked." He turned and put another log on the fire, and she thought for a moment that she had pushed too far and the careful warmth of the afternoon was about to collapse. But then he said quietly, with his back still to her, his name was Thomas. Her name was Clara. A pause, like a breath being held. "I don't say their names much anymore." "You don't have to stop," Mae said. "Saying them, I mean. It doesn't seem like you should have to stop." He turned and looked at her for a long moment. Then he put the kettle on and asked if she drank tea, and she said she did. And they sat on opposite sides of the table near the window and drank tea and talked about books for an hour and a half. And it was the longest conversation Mae had had with anyone since she had arrived in Crestfall. And she thought it was probably the longest conversation Joseph Brooks had had in considerably more time than that. She left before dark, because the path was treacherous in snow, and she had the sense to acknowledge that. At the door, he handed her back the empty tin, because she had left the biscuits on his table. "Thank you for the company," he said, and it seemed to cost him something to say it in the good way that things cost, the way a difficult truth costs more than a comfortable lie. "Thank you for the tea," she said. She was 50 yards down the path when she heard the door close behind her, and she allowed herself a full, unguarded smile that she was glad no one could see. Christmas came, and the town of Crestfall dressed itself in the modest decorations that frontier towns manage, pine boughs and candles, and the promise of a church social that half the territory would attend, because it was that or stare at the walls until spring. Mae helped organize the social with a woman named Ruth Angel, whose husband ran the livery, and together they managed a supper for 60 people that was, by all accounts, a triumph. Joseph Brooks did not attend the social, which Mae had expected, but on Christmas morning she found a small package on the step of the boarding house, wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a carved wooden bird, small enough to fit in her palm, with extraordinary attention to detail. A meadowlark, she thought, and carved with such patience and skill that she stood there in the cold doorway for a full minute, simply looking at it. She sent a note up with Tommy Patterson, who was 14 and reliable and asked no inconvenient questions, that said only, "Thank you. It is beautiful. I have put it on my window sill where the morning light finds it." 3 days after Christmas, Tommy came back down with a note that said, in a precise, clear hand, "I'm glad the light finds it. That was what I intended when I made it." Mae read that note 4 times and then put it in the back of her Shakespeare between the pages of The Tempest. The new year came in on a wind that howled down from the peaks with malicious intent, and kept everyone in Crestfall indoors for the better part of a week. Mae made use of the time to write lesson plans and read and to think, in the quiet, honest hours of early morning, about the particular quality of Joseph Brooks's attention when she spoke to him, which was total and unhurried, and made her feel as though everything she said was worth hearing. She was 31 days into 1875 when she ran into genuine trouble on the ridge path. She had gone up on a clear afternoon with a carefully wrapped bundle of sourdough starter wrapped in cloth and packed in a small crock, because she had started a new batch and wanted to share the original with someone who would use it. The sky had been clear when she left Crestfall, but the high country made its own weather with a speed that ignored the opinions of anyone caught in it, and by the time she was halfway back down the path, the sky had turned a particular ugly gray-green color that she had learned in Kansas meant business. The snow came sideways and sudden, and Mae was not foolish about weather. She knew the path well enough by now that she was not in immediate danger of getting lost, but she was also half a mile from the nearest shelter in either direction, and the wind was getting up into a register that cut through her coat like it wasn't there. She turned around and went back up. She was breathing hard and mostly snow-covered by the time she reached his door and knocked, and he opened it so quickly that she suspected he had heard the weather change and had been thinking about her on the path. He took one look at her and pulled the door wide. "Get inside," he said, and the concern in his voice was entirely unguarded, which she thought was interesting. She came inside dripping snow on his clean floor, and he had a blanket around her shoulders before she had managed to undo her coat buttons, which were stiff with cold. He sat her in the chair nearest the fire and went to build it up without asking whether she wanted him to, and she was grateful enough for the warmth that she did not comment on the fussing. "Your hands are like ice," he said, coming back from the hearth. He crouched in front of her and took both her hands between his, and the contact was so startling and so warm that she forgot for a moment to say anything sensible. "I misjudged the weather," she said. "It comes fast up here. You shouldn't come up alone when there's any question of the sky. I'll bear that in mind." He was still holding her hands, rubbing warmth back into them with a thoroughness that was entirely practical and somehow entirely not. And when he became aware of the fact, he stopped abruptly and stood up and went to put the kettle on again. "You'll have to stay until it passes," he said, his back to her. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry to impose." "You're not imposing." He said it quietly and with a finality that suggested the matter was not open for debate. She stayed 3 hours while the storm worked itself out, and they talked without the polite restraint of their first conversation. He told her about his years trapping in the high country, about the particular knowledge of the land that came from walking it in every season, about the way you learn to read the mountain the same way you learn to read a face, in all its moods and contradictions. She told him about teaching, about the moment a child understood something they hadn't understood before, about the way light changed in a classroom when a mind caught fire. He told her, in a voice she had to lean towards slightly to hear, about Clara. About how she had come from Virginia and had been afraid of nothing, not the wilderness, not the hard work, not the loneliness. About how Thomas had had her eyes and his own stubbornness. About the fever that had come with the spring thaw that year and taken them both within 8 days of each other, and how he had stood at 2 graves in the ground. He had broken himself and understood in a way that rearranged everything inside him that he did not know how to continue. "But you did continue," Mae said. "Something did," he said. "I'm not sure it was entirely me." "You kept the garden going," she said. He looked up at her. "You've kept the kitchen garden these 6 years," she said gently. "That's not nothing. You kept something alive." He was quiet for a long time, looking at the fire. Then he said, "I never thought of it that way." The storm eased around 4 in the afternoon, and the sky turned the particular pale gold of a winter sunset at high altitude, clean and almost apologetic. He walked her back down the ridge path, which surprised her, carrying a lantern though the light was still adequate, and when they reached the point where the path joined the road to town, he stopped. "Me," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and he seemed to become aware of this as he said it, a flicker of something crossing his face. "Joseph," she said deliberately and watched the flicker happen again. "Be careful on the path," he said. "In the mornings after a storm there's ice. Stay to the right side where the trees give some protection." "Thank you," she said, "for the shelter and the conversation." "It was no hardship," he said, which from Joseph Brooks was the equivalent of a declaration, and me had the sense to receive it as such. She walked back to town with the last of the gold light on the snow around her, and the carved meadowlark waiting on her window sill, and something warm settled deep in her chest that she had not felt in a long time and was not entirely ready to name. February brought the hard cold that the mountain settlers called the killing months, not because people died with any great frequency, but because everything felt more consequential in the deep of winter, each decision about wood and food and warmth, a decision about survival. Me kept her stove burning steadily and taught her classes and made her rounds of the town's families, and she went up the ridge path twice a week now, weather permitting, and sometimes Joseph came down the path and met her halfway, which was not something he did for anyone else. One afternoon she arrived to find him in considerable difficulty. His horse, a dun-colored animal named Charlie who had strong opinions about weather, had gotten into a section of fence and torn a gash along his foreleg that needed attention. Joseph had the horse tied and was trying to clean the wound while Charlie registered his displeasure with admirable vocal commitment. "Hold his head," Joseph said without looking up from what he was doing. Mae put her satchel down, pulled off her good gloves and tucked them in her pocket, and took Charlie's head between her hands and spoke quietly and directly into his ear in a tone that she had used on upset children, and that worked, to her mild satisfaction, on upset horses. Charlie settled enough for Joseph to work. "Where did you learn to do that?" he asked, focused on the leg. "I grew up with horses," she said. "In Kansas we had 3. They worked together for the better part of an hour, and when it was done and Charlie was back in the small stable with a clean bandage and a mouthful of hay, Joseph leaned against the stable doorframe and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of open admiration. "You're useful," he said. Mae laughed, a real laugh, and he blinked as though the sound had surprised him. "That is possibly the most practical compliment I have ever received," she said. "I meant it as one," he said, and the corner of his mouth was doing that particular thing that she had come to understand was his full smile, contained and genuine. They went inside and she made supper while he cleaned up, and they ate at the table by the window with the last light going off the snow outside and the fire going well, and the cabin smelling of wood smoke and the dried sage that hung in a bundle near the door. And Mae thought that she could not remember the last time a meal had tasted this good or a room had felt this much like itself. "Tell me something you've never told anyone," he said, out of nowhere, and she looked up from her plate. "That's a large request," she said. "I know," she thought about it. Then she said, "I wanted to be a naturalist when I was a girl. I read everything I could about the natural world and I kept a journal of every species I encountered, and I wrote to a professor in Cincinnati whose name I found in a journal, and he wrote back to me." She paused. "He said it was fine work for a girl my age, but that the field was not really open to women and I should perhaps consider teaching instead." She looked at her plate. "I did consider it. And I do love teaching, but sometimes I think about that journal." Joseph looked at her steadily. "You could still keep it," he said. "Nothing's stopping you." "No," she said slowly. "I suppose nothing is. I have a compendium of Colorado Territory flora and fauna on the shelf. You're welcome to borrow it." She looked at him with a warmth that she made no effort to conceal. "Thank you. You could probably add to it," he said. "Given the time you spend on that path, I've seen species up here that aren't in any book I've read." She would remember that moment later as the one in which she understood the full weight of what was happening between them. Not a growing friendship, though it was that too, but something with deeper roots and a stronger pull. She looked at Joseph Brooks across that simple table in the firelight and understood that somewhere in the weeks of bread and apple butter and ginger biscuits and carved birds and honest conversation, she had fallen properly and entirely in love with him, and that the falling had been so gradual and so complete that there was no undoing it. She said nothing of the sort, of course. She was Mae Langley, and Mae Langley was practical, and so she asked him to tell her about the species he had seen on the mountain, and he did, and the evening wore on in warmth and ease, and neither of them mentioned what was sitting at the center of the room, patient as a mountain, waiting to be acknowledged. March came with mud and the first tentative green of the snowmelt, and with it came a man named Arden Cross who arrived in Crestfall from the south with a wagon full of dry goods, and a manner that several people in town found agreeable enough on first meeting. He was a trader, he said, looking to establish a regular route through the mountain towns. He was good-looking in a practiced way, with easy manners and an easy smile, and he began making particular efforts to speak with me whenever their paths crossed in town, which was frequent enough that she began to time her errands to the general store with some care. She mentioned Arden Cross to Joseph on a Thursday afternoon when she came up the path to return the borrowed compendium, and to bring a packet of coffee beans that she had ground herself from a bag she'd ordered from Bernadette specifically, because she'd noticed his supply was running low. Joseph was quiet for a moment after she mentioned Arden Cross, quiet in a particular way that me recognized as him thinking carefully before he spoke. "What do you know about him?" he asked. "Not much. He seems pleasant enough, though there's something about his manner that sits with me in the same way a wrong note sits in a song. You can't always say what it is." "Trust that," Joseph said simply. "I generally do." She paused. "He asked me to supper at the Coles establishment on Saturday." Another silence, this one of a different texture. "What did you say?" His voice was even. "I said I would think about it." She looked at him directly. "I said that because I genuinely hadn't decided. I thought I should mention it." He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, or rather she had seen parts of it, the attention, the care, the restraint, but not all of them gathered together like this. "You should do as you see fit," he said, and the evenness of his voice cost him. She could hear it. "Joseph." She said his name the way she had learned to say it, clearly and with intention. "I am telling you because I want to know whether you have any particular feelings on the matter." The silence between them was full and charged, and she held his gaze with a steadiness she was proud of. "Me," he said, and stopped. "Yes." He looked at the window, then at his hands, then back at her. "I have not been a man who deserved anyone's attention for a long time," he said. "I made my peace with that." "That's not what I asked you," she said gently. He looked at her for a long time with that total, unhurried attention of his, and then he said very quietly, "I don't want you to go to supper with Arden Cross." "Then I won't," she said. The simplicity of it seemed to undo something in him. He sat very still and then said, "That seems too easy." "It isn't easy," me said. "I'm not saying what I'm saying is easy, but I am saying it plainly because I think we have earned the right to be plain with each other." "What are you saying plainly?" he asked, and the hope in his voice was the most careful, guarded thing she had ever heard. The hope of someone who had learned what it cost to hope and was doing it anyway. "I'm saying that I come up this ridge path twice a week not because of any surplus of baked goods," she said, "and I think you know that." He stood up and came around the table and stood close to her, and she looked up at him in the fire-lit cabin, and the mountain wind moved outside and the world was entirely still. "I don't know how to do this anymore," he said. "I don't know if I'm capable of it." "I think you have been doing it for months," she said. "I think we both have." He reached out and took her hand carefully, the way he had in the cold after the storm, but differently now, with intention rather than practicality, and she turned her hand over and held his back. "There's considerable risk," he said. "There is always considerable risk," she said. "I left Ohio and came to Kansas and then to a mountain town in Colorado Territory. I have been doing considerable risk my entire adult life." The corner of his mouth did its thing that contained genuine motion. "I don't have much to offer," he said. "A cabin on a ridge and a horse with opinions." "I have a schoolroom and a boarding house room with one window," she said. "We are well matched." He looked at her for a moment longer, and then he leaned down and kissed her, slowly and with great care, and she kissed him back with equal care and equal intention, and the fire went on burning and the mountain went on standing, and the world, which had seemed so contingent and uncertain, arranged itself into something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like a foundation. She did not go to supper with Arden Cross. The matter of Arden Cross did not, as it happened, resolve itself simply. 2 weeks after me had declined his invitation, one of the Harmon boys came into town with a face that said clearly something had gone wrong, and reported to anyone within earshot that their father's cattle had broken through a fence in the night, and a third of them had been found the next morning with the brand worked over, and that a wagon matching the description of Arden Cross's had been seen on the Harmon Road around midnight. Joseph came down the mountain the morning he heard this news, which was not something he did often, and not for any reason less than serious. He came to the schoolhouse at the morning recess and found me in the yard with her students, and when she saw his expression, she sent the children inside with a task to occupy them. "Cross is not who he presented himself to be," Joseph said. He told her briefly what he had heard, and also what he had discovered himself, which was that the man had a history in 3 other towns south of Crestfall of exactly this sort of operation, moving through communities, establishing trust, and then making use of it in ways that left people worse off. "I want you to be careful," Joseph said. "He was particular in his attention to you. That may have been genuine or it may have been strategic. Either way, I want you to be careful." "I'll be careful," she said, "but I'm not in the habit of being frightened by men like that." "I know you're not. I'm not asking you to be frightened. I'm asking you to be cautious." "Those are different things," she acknowledged. "They are," he said. He looked at her steadily. "And I'm asking because it matters to me what happens to you." She reached out and touched his arm briefly in a gesture that was both simple and complete. "I know it does," she said. "The same is true in the other direction." Arden Cross left Crestfall under circumstances that involved a visit from the county sheriff's deputy, who had been tracking similar reports south of the territory line, and the Harmon cattle were sorted out over the following days. It was not a violent affair, which Mae was grateful for, though she knew the West could rarely promise that. Cross rode out with a deputy on either side of him, and the town watched him go with the particular satisfaction of a community that had not been as fooled as he'd hoped. Joseph was one of those who stood watching at the edge of the road, and when the party had gone he caught Mae's eye across the distance and nodded once, and she nodded back, and Bernadette, who was standing beside me, made a sound of supreme satisfaction. "I have been waiting," Bernadette said serenely, "for that man to come down off his mountain." "He hasn't come down off his mountain yet," Mae said, keeping her expression neutral. "Mae Langley," Bernadette said. "I have been running this store for 15 years, and I know what a man looks like when he's reconsidering all of his fundamental positions, and I know what a woman looks like when she is the cause of it." Mae found something to study on the street ahead of her. April came in warm and golden, and the mountain paths dried out, and the snowmelt fed the creek to a full, rushing voice, and everything that had been underground worked its way up through the soil and presented itself with the confidence of things that have been waiting patiently for the right conditions. Mae began her naturalist's journal in the compendium's margins first, and then in a proper notebook that Bernadette ordered for her from Denver, and she walked the ridge path now with her eyes on everything, naming and noting and sketching in the careful, precise style she had practiced as a girl in Cincinnati. Joseph walked with her sometimes on these expeditions, telling her the names of plants and animals with the easy knowledge of a man who had spent years paying attention to the world he moved through. He taught her to read tracks in the soft spring mud, to identify birdsong, to know the difference between the weather a particular cloud formation promised and the weather it delivered. She taught him the Latin nomenclature for the species they found, which he received with more interest than she had expected, and they fell into the habit of teaching each other as naturally as they had fallen into the habit of everything else. One afternoon in late April she came upon him sitting on a flat boulder above the tree line with a small, battered notebook in his hands, writing. He looked up and closed the notebook with the particular speed of someone caught at something private, and she sat down beside him on the rock and looked out at the valley below where Crestfall sat small and orderly in the afternoon light. "What do you write?" she asked. A pause. Then, "Things I want to remember." "You could share them," she said, "if you wanted to." "Perhaps someday," he said, and she did not push, because she had learned the architecture of his silences and knew which ones were closed and which were open. They sat on the rock for an hour and watched the valley and the sky, and at some point the distance between them on the rock closed without either of them making a deliberate movement, the way rivers find the sea, through natural inclination rather than planned route, and she rested her head against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and the mountains stood around them in their enormous ancient patience. "I want to say something," he said after a time. "Then say it," she said, without lifting her head. "I have been trying to find the right words for several weeks," he said, "which is not like me generally. I am not a man who usually requires much searching." "You're usually quite economical," she agreed. "I want to tell you," he said carefully, "that whatever I was before you started coming up that path, and I know what I was not a man who had much to look forward to, A pause. I am now. I look forward to most things, and you are the reason for it, and I want you to know that. Mae lifted her head and looked at him with eyes that were entirely full. Joseph Brooks, she said. Mae Langley, he said. I love you, she said, because she had always believed that plain speaking was a form of respect, and because the plainest plain truth she had available to her in that moment was that one. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who has been given something he was certain he had no right to, and then he said, with a care and a steadiness that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, I love you. I have loved you since you left bread on my doorstep, and I didn't say thank you for a week. And I have loved you with increasing conviction since I watched you calm a panicking horse by whispering in its ear. She laughed, and he smiled, the full version, not the contained corner movement but the actual full thing that was rare and complete. And then he kissed her on top of a flat rock above the tree line in Colorado Territory in April of 1875. While a red-tailed hawk drew circles in the clean blue sky above them, and the world was exactly what it should be. Mae brought a new complexity to the arrangement in the form of Crestfall's opinion about it, which was not uniformly enthusiastic. Most of the town received the news that Mae Langley and Joseph Brooks were keeping company with the quiet satisfaction of people who had been hoping for exactly this. But there were some who considered it irregular. A schoolteacher and a mountain man who barely came to town, and who thought Mae should set her sights on someone more settled, meaning someone who came to church and attended community meetings, and did not live 2 miles up a ridge in a cabin that most of them had never visited. Mae received these opinions with equanimity, and did not allow them to alter her course by so much as half a degree. The person whose opinion surprised her most was the Reverend, a man named Gerald Fitch who had been at the Crestfall Church for a decade, and whom Mae had considered a generally tolerant person. He came to the schoolhouse one afternoon and made a gentle, careful speech about reputation and suitability, and the particular vulnerability of a woman alone in a small community, and Mae listened to him with complete attention until he was finished. Then she said, Reverend Fitch, I appreciate that you say this in genuine care for my welfare. But I am 24 years old and I have been making my own decisions for considerably more years than most women my age, and I am not inclined to stop now. Joseph Brooks is a man of integrity and I will not tolerate any suggestion to the contrary. The Reverend looked at her for a moment, and then something in his expression relaxed. I don't believe I suggested anything to the contrary, he said carefully. No, Mae agreed. You suggested only that his geography was inconvenient, and on that point I am willing to make adjustments. The Reverend left looking thoughtful, and Mae went back to her lesson planning with a vigor that was partly fueled by righteous indignation, and partly by the knowledge that she had meant what she said about making adjustments, and that she was going to need to have a particular conversation with Joseph. She had that conversation on a Sunday afternoon in May, sitting at his table with the kitchen garden visible through the window, showing the first real green of the season. The cabin is 2 miles from the schoolhouse, she said. It is, he agreed. That is 2 miles that I am not currently counting as a hardship, she said carefully. But it is 2 miles that would become relevant if the arrangement between us were to change. He looked at her steadily. What arrangement are you suggesting might change? I'm not suggesting anything, she said. I'm having a conversation. About what specifically? About whether this is where you intend to be, she said. In this cabin on this ridge. Long term. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the garden through the window. I built this cabin, he said. I built it for Clara and for Thomas. I've thought about that. I know you have, she said gently. And I've thought about the fact that a cabin is boards and stone, he said. That the people who make a place a home are not interchangeable with the place itself. He looked at her. What I'm saying is that I have no particular attachment to the building. I have an attachment to the land. The 2 miles of land between here and town is some of the best land in the territory. It is, she agreed. A man could build closer to town, he said, if there were reason to. A man could also take on a slightly less solitary occupation than solitary trapping, she said, carefully, if he were inclined. The Patterson property is looking to hire on a hand for the spring roundup, and Mr. Patterson mentioned to me last week that he'd be grateful if someone with knowledge of the high country could be persuaded to advise on the upper pasture. Joseph looked at her with a clear appreciation of what she was doing, which was solving problems ahead of his acknowledging them. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "I think about most things for a while," she said. "So have I," he said. He reached across the table and took her hand. "There is one more thing I would like to think about with you." "Yes," she said. "Whether you would be willing to be married to a man who is not always easy to live with," he said, "who is still learning how to be less alone, who has a kitchen garden and a horse with opinions and considerable affection for your company." Me looked at him across the table in the spring light, at this man who had told her he had no use for kindness, and had kept everything she left on his doorstep and had built, piece by careful piece, a new structure from the ruins of a grief that would have broken most people entirely. "I would be willing," she said, "with full knowledge of all of the above." He squeezed her hand, and his expression was the clearest she had ever seen it, open and certain and very nearly undone in the best possible way. "Then I would like very much to ask you properly," he said, "as soon as I have had time to do it in the way you deserve." "I don't need anything grand," she said. "I know you don't," he said. "That doesn't mean you don't deserve it." The proper asking happened 3 weeks later, on an evening in June when the mountain meadows were full of wildflowers, and the sky stayed light until well past 8 o'clock. He walked her out to the upper meadow above the tree line, carrying a small supper in a cloth, and they sat in the flowers and watched the sky go through its evening progression from blue to gold, to rose to the deep, clear lavender of a mountain twilight. And then he reached into his coat pocket and took out a ring that had been his grandmother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet set into it, and he said what he had to say with the clarity and directness that was his nature. "I want to build a life with you," he said. "I want to build it on ground we choose together, and I want it to be long and honest and full of the things that matter. I want to hear you talk about the natural world, and I want to walk beside you on the paths you walk, and I want to be the man who deserves your particular kind of stubbornness directed at him for the rest of my life." A pause. "Will you marry me, Mae Langley?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation or qualification. "I will." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it in the last of the evening light, and then she looked at him, and the full weight of the happiness she felt was so complete and so clear that she could not have described it with any precision, except to say that it felt like arriving somewhere she had been traveling toward without knowing it for a very long time. They were married in September of 1875 in the slightly east-leaning church in Crestfall, in a ceremony attended by what felt like every person in the territory within riding distance, because news travels in mountain communities in direct proportion to how heartfelt the occasion is. Bernadette Coles wept openly and without apology. Ruth Engel stood up for me, and Old Harmon stood up for Joseph, and Reverend Fitch, who had revised his position on the match entirely and completely, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth. Me wore her best dress, which was a deep blue that Bernadette had ordered from Denver in a moment of inspired generosity, and she had her dark hair down for the first time in Crestfall, which produced in Joseph Brooks an expression that was on the far side of contained, and several people later commented on quietly to their spouses. Joseph wore his good coat and a clean shirt and had trimmed his beard with exceptional care, and when me walked into the church and their eyes met, the smile on his face was the full, uncontained version, and there was not a dry eye in the building, which pleased me very much. After the ceremony, there was a supper at the Coles establishment that lasted well into the evening, with fiddle music provided by a rancher named Pete Davies, who was better on the fiddle than he was on the range, and dancing that went on until the stars were high. Joseph danced with me twice, which for a man who had not been to a social in 6 years was remarkable, and for a man who turned out to have a quiet, unpracticed grace about it, once he stopped worrying about what anyone else thought, was even more remarkable. They went back to the cabin that night, the two of them, with the mountain dark and starlit around them and the path clear and familiar underfoot, and the cabin that Joseph had kept all these years with its fire and its books and its kitchen garden was now the first night of a different thing entirely. They spent the fall settling into the shape of their life together, which was not always easy and was never dull. Joseph took the work with the Patterson ranch that Mae had mentioned, and it suited him, the work with land and animals and the particular freedom of not being entirely alone in his occupation. He kept his trapping lines in the upper country through the winter for the additional income, and because it was work he knew and loved, and Mae kept her classes at the schoolhouse, and they met in the middle in the cabin on the ridge each evening with supper and conversation, and the fire going and the world outside doing whatever it was inclined to do. They argued sometimes, because they were two people with strong convictions and a shared tendency to believe they were right. And the arguments were occasionally heated and always honest and always resolved, which Mae considered the most important part. She had known couples who fought like cats, and she had known couples who never fought at all and wore the corrosive politeness of avoided truth like armor, and she thought neither was the model she wanted. She wanted this, plain speaking, genuine conflict, genuine resolution, and the warmth that came after. Joseph was learning, slowly and with visible effort, to ask for what he needed rather than going quiet with it, and Mae was learning to give him the space his nature required without interpreting it as withdrawal. They taught each other their particular languages and grew more fluent in them with each passing season. The first spring of their marriage, Mae found that she was expecting a child, which she discovered in April and told Joseph on a Thursday evening when they were walking the upper meadow path in the last of the day's light. She had thought about how to say it for 2 days, and in the end she simply stopped walking and turned to face him and said, "I believe we are going to have a child." Joseph stopped walking. He stood very still for a moment, and Mae watched his face move through a sequence of expressions that she could map with some accuracy. There was the first response, which was joy, clear and immediate and entirely unguarded. And then there was the second response, which was fear, the old and understandable fear of a man who had lost a child and a wife and knew in his bones how quickly the world could undo what it gave you. She went to him and took his hands and held them and looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I know what you're thinking." "Me," he said, and his voice was rough. "I know," she said again, "and I'm not going to tell you not to be afraid. But I am going to tell you that I am strong and I am careful, and Dr. Hale, when he is sober, is a better physician than his premises suggest, and that whatever comes, we will face it together. And I am going to tell you that I am very glad." He pulled her against him and held on with both arms, and she felt the fear and the joy working in him simultaneously, inseparable, and she held on in return. "I am also very glad," he said into her hair. "Terribly glad." He pulled back and looked at her. "Are you well? You feel well?" "I feel exceptionally well," she said truthfully. "You'll tell me if that changes," he said. "Immediately," she said. "You will be the first to know." He kept his hand over hers as they walked back to the cabin in the evening, and that night he wrote in his small notebook for a long time after she was asleep, and when she asked him in the morning what he had written, he said, "Things I want to remember. Things I want to say to someone someday who isn't here yet." She thought that was among the finest things she had ever heard anyone say. The child was born in November of 1876, a boy, delivered by Dr. Emmett Hale on a clear, cold morning, with Joseph pacing the main room of the cabin with a controlled restlessness that wore a visible groove in the floorboards. When the cry came, Joseph stopped moving entirely, like a man stopped by a sound, and then Mae called his name, and he came to the door of the room and looked at her holding the baby, and his face was entirely undone in a way that she had never seen before on any human being. She put the baby in his arms and said, "Say hello to your son." Joseph looked at the baby for a long time without speaking. The baby looked back at him with the unfocused, solemn attention of the newly arrived. "Hello, Thomas," Joseph said, very quietly. Me felt the tears on her own face and did not try to stop them. "Hello, Thomas," she agreed. Thomas Brooks entered the world on a Thursday and immediately made his position clear regarding sleep schedules, which was that he found them an imposition, a position his parents negotiated with him over the following months with varying success. He was a vigorous, clear-eyed, entirely opinionated child who bore a striking resemblance to his father in his focused attention and his mother in his stubbornness, which combination everyone in Crestfall considered particularly fair. Joseph Brooks changed so gradually and so thoroughly in the years that followed that it was only by looking at the before, and after that you could measure the distance traveled. He came to town regularly now, not because he had to, but because he had people he wanted to see, a different motivation entirely. He attended the church social at Christmas and the 4th of July gathering, and the town meetings at which community matters were decided, and he sat in those meetings with the quality of attention he brought to everything, and occasionally said something that was brief and precise and exactly on point, and people listened. He was not a transformed man in the sense of having become someone else. He was a revealed man, which was different. The isolation had been a carapace, not a nature, and what was underneath it was a person of considerable warmth and depth and genuine humor, which the carapace had concealed from everyone including, me suspected, himself. The kitchen garden flourished. He expanded it in the spring of their second year together, adding more beds and a small greenhouse against the south wall of the cabin that he built himself from salvaged glass panes, which extended the growing season and produced tomatoes in August that were a source of genuine pride and the subject of a standing arrangement with Bernadette's store. Me kept her journal, which grew into a proper record of the flora and fauna of the San Juan foothills, and which she sent portions of, over the years, to a natural history society in Denver that had been established in the years after the war. They wrote back with interest and published 3 of her essays in their quarterly, which arrived in Crestfall to considerable local celebration, and which Joseph put carefully on the bookshelf next to the compendium from which they had begun. The second child came in the spring of 1879, a girl they named Clara, and this time Joseph was calmer in the waiting, not because he was less invested, but because he had been through it once and had arrived safely on the other side, and had enough trust in me and in the world built carefully enough to carry the waiting without being undone by it. Clara arrived in April with red hair that was a mystery to both parents and a sunny disposition that was a mystery to no one who knew me. Thomas was 2 years old when Clara arrived and received the news of a sibling with the philosophical acceptance of a child who had been talked to honestly about most things and trusted the world to manage itself. He gave the baby a serious look and then went back to his blocks, which me considered an appropriate response. There were years of fullness between those small milestones, years of seasons and work, and the particular texture of a life built with both hands, knowing what you have and tending it. Joseph finished building a larger cabin 3/4 of a mile down from the original, closer to the road, on the south-facing slope where the light came early and stayed late, a proper 2-story house with good windows and a covered porch, and a room for each child and a study for me where she could write and a workshop for Joseph where he could carve, because he had never stopped, the wood carving. And the shelves of the house held birds and animals and small objects of such artistry that visitors regularly asked to buy them and were regularly declined. He gave them away instead, the carvings, to people who needed something beautiful. Me pointed out once that this was a form of kindness, and he said, without so much as a blink, "I know. I have revised my position on kindness." She laughed and kissed him in the workshop, to the mild embarrassment of Thomas, who was 8 and had views about parental behavior. Bernadette Coles remained a fixture of their lives throughout all of this, aging gracefully and with the deep satisfaction of a woman who had watched something she hoped for come true. She took considerable personal credit for it, and Mae allowed her this with full gratitude. Ruth Engel's husband had taken on a partner at the livery by 1880, a young man named Daniel who had come from Virginia, and who brought with him the particular earnestness of someone starting fresh, and who spent considerable time around the Brooks household, officially to help with the spring work, but obviously drawn by the quiet, watchful attention of a young man in the vicinity of Clara Brooks, who was 10 years younger than Daniel and very much a child, and would not be any kind of concern until she was fully grown and the years had narrowed between them to something sensible. In the autumn of 1882, a letter arrived for me that she read twice before she told Joseph about it. It was from the Natural History Society in Denver, addressed to Miss Mae Langley, because they had not updated their correspondence to reflect her marriage, and it asked whether she would be interested in compiling her observations into a fuller monograph for publication, under the auspices of the Society, as a contribution to the documented natural history of the Colorado Territory. The Society was, the letter noted, increasingly interested in contributions from observers in the field, and her work over the preceding years had been noted as exceptional. "They want me to write a book," she said, when she told Joseph that evening. He looked up from the notebook he was writing in with the steadiness of a man who is not surprised by good things happening to people who deserve them. "Of course they do," he said. "It would take at least a year," she said. "More likely 2. Then it will take 2 years. I would need time set aside. The children are old enough for me to—" "Me," he said simply. She stopped. "Sit down and start writing," he said. She looked at him across the firelit room where the children were asleep, and the mountain was dark outside, and the carved birds were on every surface, and the books were on every shelf, at this man who had needed no kindness and had kept everything she left on his doorstep, who had opened a door in the middle of a winter storm and shown her in and made tea, who had said Thomas and Clara over a fire and allowed himself to be loved back into the world. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said. "I love you. Sit down and start writing." She laughed and she sat down at her desk, and she opened her notebook and she started writing. The monograph took 2 years, as predicted, and was published in the spring of 1885 by the Denver Society for Natural History under the title Colorado Territory Flora and Fauna. Field Observations from the San Juan Foothills, by Mae Brooks, Mae Langley, Crestfall, Colorado. Bernadette ordered 6 copies before the thing was even released, and distributed them among the families of Crestfall with the authority of a woman running a community library. Thomas was 9 by then and old enough to understand what the book meant, and young enough to think his mother had done something that proved all mothers were slightly miraculous, which Mae considered exactly the right takeaway. Clara was 6 and spent considerable time informing her classmates that her mother had written a book, factually and without modesty, which was entirely on character. Joseph took 1 copy of the book and put it on the shelf next to the compendium, which was where it belonged, and that evening he brought out his own notebook, the small battered one, and put it on the table. "I want to show you something," he said. She opened it. It was full from front to back in his precise, clear hand. Years of entries, thoughts and observations and descriptions of the mountain in every season, and among them, recorded in plain and careful language, the story of a woman who had left things on his doorstep and never asked for credit, and of what it had done to him, the receiving of all that unhurried, unapologetic kindness, and what he had made of it. She read for a long time, and when she looked up she was crying, and he was watching her with the full, open expression of a man who had finished being afraid of being seen. "This is extraordinary," she said. "Joseph, this is extraordinary writing." He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you should have it. You should publish it," she said. I don't know about that. I do, she said firmly. He did not publish it that year, but the year after, he showed it to Me's editor at the Denver Society, a mild man with excellent judgment who read it over 3 days and wrote back with a letter that surprised Joseph so thoroughly that he read it 3 times to make sure it said what he thought it said. It said that it was the finest piece of personal natural history and memoir he had encountered in 20 years of editing, and asked if Mr. Brooks would be amenable to discussing publication. Mr. Brooks was, it turned out, amenable. The book was called simply The Mountain, which was characteristic of Joseph in its precision, and it was published in 1887, and it was read, over the years that followed, by more people than either of them ever expected. None of this made them rich, because the West in 1887 was still very much a place where you measured wealth in what you'd built and kept rather than what you'd accumulated, and their wealth by that measure was considerable. The house was good and warm and full of books and carved birds. The kitchen garden produced abundantly. Charlie the horse had been retired with the dignity his opinions deserved and replaced by a pair of steady roans, who had no particular personality, but were entirely reliable, which Joseph maintained was the preferable attribute in a working animal. Thomas grew into a young man with his father's height and his mother's way with words, and at 17, he was already a better hand than most of the men on the Patterson ranch where he spent his summers, and he had a notebook of his own that he kept private in the way his father had kept his, which me took as a very good sign and did not intrude upon. Clara at 15 was a force of nature in all the ways that this expression suggests, with her mother's directness and her father's focus, and a tendency to befriend everyone she encountered from the schoolyard to the county seat, which was a useful combination in a woman who would spend her life in a world that did not always make room for women with strong convictions and better arguments. There was a moment, on a September evening in 1888, that me would keep longer than most. She was on the porch of the house in the last of the afternoon light, working on a new set of field notes, and Joseph came around the corner from the workshop with wood shavings on his coat, and sat down beside her on the porch bench with the ease of a man entirely at home, in the place he has chosen to be. Thomas was down the ridge at the Pattersons, and Clara was in the house, audible through the window in a spirited conversation with herself about something that appeared to require both sides of the argument. "Anything interesting in the field notes?" Joseph asked. "There's a pair of golden eagles nesting on the east face," she said. "I think they've been there for 3 seasons, but I couldn't confirm it until this year." "I've seen them," he said. "Took them for the same pair each time. The female has a mark on her right wing." "I know the mark," Me said. "I've noted it." He leaned over and looked at her notes, reading upside down with the ease of long practice, and made a small sound of agreement. Then he leaned back and looked at the mountain, and she looked at him, and the evening was full of the smells of autumn and wood smoke, and the garden still green at its edges, and Clara's voice came through the window in a particularly rhetorical flourish, and somewhere down the slope a woodpecker was making its steady argument against a dead pine. "I want to say something," Joseph said, which was how he began things he had been thinking about for a while. "Then say it," she said, which was what she always said. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the day you left bread on my doorstep." "That was 14 years ago," she said. "I know. I've been thinking about it for approximately 14 years. He paused. "I want you to know that I think about it as the beginning of all of this, a gesture that encompassed the house and the mountain and the evening and Clara's voice and the probable location of Thomas down the slope. I don't believe in many things that could fairly be called inevitable, but I believe the bread was." Me looked at him with everything she felt written plainly on her face, because she had long since stopped managing her expression where Joseph was concerned. "I kept coming back," she said. "Every time," he said. "I want you to know that I kept every single thing you ever left on that step. The bread and the apple butter and the biscuits, in spirit if not in fact. I know," she said. "I knew when you left me the sage." He reached over and took her hand the way he had in every season of the years between then and now, and she laced her fingers through his. "The sage was an emergency measure," he said. "I didn't know how else to say what I was trying to say." "You said it perfectly," she said. Clara's voice through the window arrived at some kind of conclusion and went quiet. The mountain stood in the evening light, exactly as it had stood when Mae had walked up the path with bread under her arm for the first time, enormous and patient, and entirely indifferent to the small dramas of the creatures on its slopes, which was fine, because those creatures were doing well enough on their own. Thomas came home before dark, as he had been asked, and came up the porch steps with a story about a fence that needed mending, and a very specific and somewhat technical argument for why it was not his fault, which he delivered with such evident craft that Joseph listened to the whole thing before pointing out that the fence had not in fact been in question, and that they had not been worried about the fence. They had been worried about Thomas, who was fine, and the fence could wait until morning. Thomas considered this and accepted it with good grace and went inside. Clara appeared in the doorway with a question about supper that rapidly became a conversation about the migratory patterns of certain bird species that Mae had mentioned at breakfast, and that had apparently been occupying Clara's mind for the intervening hours. And the conversation lasted through supper preparation and through the meal itself, and did not conclude until Joseph, with the patience of a man who has learned over the years that the conversations around his table are among the finest things available to him, pointed out that the birds in question had almost certainly reached their winter grounds by now, and the question could be continued in the morning. Clara said she supposed it could, and began clearing the table with the decisive energy of someone who is not actually done thinking about the subject, and intends to return to it at breakfast. Mae caught Joseph's eye across the table, and they shared a look that said everything two people say to each other across a dinner table when they know exactly where they are and exactly what they have, and the knowing is the fullness of it. Later, when the house was quiet and the fire was low and Thomas and Clara were asleep in their rooms, Mae stood at the window of the bedroom that looked north toward the upper peak, which in the moonlight was silver and absolute. Joseph came to stand beside her. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "The mountain," she said. He looked at it with her for a moment. "I remember thinking," he said, "when I first came up here, when I built the cabin and started trapping and told myself I had no use for anything the world had to offer, I remember looking at the mountain and thinking it was the only honest thing I'd ever found, because it didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was." "And now?" she asked. He looked at her in the moonlight, with the full, clear expression she had spent 14 years learning and would spend the rest of her life in the company of. "Now I know it was only the beginning of the list," he said. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they stood at the window while the moon went slowly across the sky above the San Juan range, and the mountain stood in the silver light, and the house was warm behind them, and their children slept in their rooms, and the kitchen garden was put to bed for winter. And on the bookshelf in the study, the compendium and the monograph and the small dark book called The Mountain stood side by side in the order they had been placed there. Which was the order they had been made, which was the only order that mattered. Outside, under the porch eave where Mae had nailed a small wooden shelf in the second spring of their marriage, a carved meadowlark sat with its wings spread slightly, as though it had just arrived, or was just about to go, and had found itself in no particular hurry to decide.